Good evening. Good evening and welcome to First United Methodist Church and to this panel discussion on understanding the transgender experience. We're glad that you came out on such a really awful night with a World Series game coming up. So we'll see. So we're very glad to have you here, and I just, if you haven't been in our building before, I'll just note that there are restrooms all the way down the hall on the right. If you'll go out this door and down the hall, you'll see them. And afterwards, we've got some refreshments in our library, which is directly across the hall, and we hope you'll join us for some informal conversation. Look at my notes here. Several groups that I want to thank for their support of this event. The Melrose Clergy Association has supported it, the Melrose Human Rights Commission, and especially Speak Out Boston. Speak Out Boston is LGBTQIA Speakers Bureau, which provides volunteers who travel around to share their stories so that people might understand and open their minds. We do have baskets in the entryway. If you'd like to make a contribution to the work of Speak Out, we would be glad to receive those donations tonight. The format tonight, this will be a moderated discussion. We're going to begin with asking each of our panelists to tell their story for 5 or 7 minutes, just to introduce themselves and so that you can understand who they are and what their lives are like. Then there will be question and response time, and Stuart Lanier is going to moderate that. Think of the questions that you've got, save them up, and you can direct them at a particular panelist or at all of them. And we will pass the microphone around. We are recording this for MMTV so that it can be shown in the days leading up to the election so that people who can't be here can see it. And we'll end by 8:45. So I have just very brief introductions to our panelists. They will tell you much more about themselves. David Weekly is the pastor of St. Nicholas United Methodist Church in Hull. He's a doctoral graduate of BU School of Theology. He writes and speaks on transgender social and spiritual issues. He is originally from Oregon. And in 2009, David shared his transgender history with our United Methodist Conference, and if you're not familiar with United Methodism, that was a bold and brave act because we are still a denomination intensely divided on these issues. Liz DeSelm is with us. She is a member of the Melrose School Committee. She is the first trans person to be elected in Melrose and the third in the state to be elected. She has a wife and 2 kids, and by day, she is a chemist. Mimi LeMay, a former Melrose resident who has recently moved. She's the author of a book that's coming out about her story with her son, Jacob. Is there a name to that book yet?
You're the first to hear it. It's not official.
Okay.
But Boy Wonder.
Boy Wonder. Wonderful. And Eli is a former middle school educator for 15 years. He's now currently a research specialist, see if I can get this right, adolescent and young adult health disparities among LGBTQI young people. Yes. So these are our panelists, and we're just going to begin by asking you all to share your stories, and let's begin with Liz.
Can you all hear me all right? Do I need to move the mic closer? Move the mic closer. Is that better? Okay, there you go. My name is Elizabeth DeSelm. I transitioned in my early 30s. My life is a pretty open book, so I'll tell you a little bit about growing up. I grew up in a military household. I was a Navy brat. And I had no words, no language to describe who I was. A big part of my history was trying to identify with who I was and reconcile that with who I was told I was, and trying to live into that experience. And so you might imagine that trying to live into something you're not is fraught with shame, self-loathing. Depression was certainly a big part of that. When I eventually hit a breaking point and I had to seek help, and I did eventually begin transitioning, it was like I saw color for the first time. I actually began to see and live in the world around me rather than this shell of a person that I was. And so I wouldn't be here as who I am today if I hadn't hit that point. And I'd be remiss to say, if I didn't say that my wife and my family played a huge part of who I am today. I'm still with my wife of 18 years. We've been together for much longer than that. Our kids have been successful and they've thrived and graduated. One's graduated from high school and is in college. I cannot stress enough that while this journey was very challenging, and while this journey certainly had a roller coaster ride of ups and downs, it was absolutely worth it. If you'll indulge me for just a moment, you may have heard me talk a lot at the school committee, at the Board of Aldermen, and elsewhere with regards to Yes on 3 and why this bill is important. If you'll give me a moment to talk about why the opponents, the people who brought this on the ballot in the first place, talk about it as a bathroom bill. My own experiences with bathrooms, and please keep in mind that I'm as uncomfortable in the restroom as everybody else. Usually we go in there and we do what we need to do and we move on. If you take away public accommodations, and I consider the bathroom, public use of a restroom, to be the most basic of public accommodations, if you remove the ability of a minority to use restrooms in public society, you remove their ability to function in public society. So ultimately, this is not merely a fearmonger tactic. This is you're not worthy to function in our society. We want to marginalize you and we want to dehumanize you. Okay? And this leads to a level of angst, mental health issues. 40%, there's a group called the National Center for Transgender Equality out of DC, and they do a survey every year with regards to what transgender people face. The 2015 survey, I'm moving this back a little bit, the 2015 survey, 40% stated that they had been harassed at work. This is 40% of over 27,000 self-identified trans people. 40% said they were harassed at work. 29% said they lived at or below the poverty line, and 15% said they were unemployed or unemployable because they were trans. So this is all about marginalization and dehumanization. My own bathroom story, when I transitioned at work, and I did transition, I had already transitioned much outside of work by the time I actually went to my manager. The first manager I told I was having a really bad day and I struggled, and I said, and by the way, I'm transitioning, I'm transgender, and his response was, good luck with that. Yeah. But when I transitioned at work, I asked to use the women's room down the hall. And what I got was, no, you will go down 3 flights of stairs. We were at the far end of a wing of the building. You will go to the very front of the building, out into the lobby where there's gender-neutral bathrooms, and you will use those. So essentially what they were telling me is I had to leave the building to use the restroom. I did eventually get access to the women's room, and the sky didn't fall. But again, the story here is that we are simply looking for the basic rights that so many people take for granted. I cannot tell you what it's like to wake up every morning before I transitioned and not know who I was, to put on this mask, this cloak of who I was expected to be, versus how I can wake up today and I know who I am. It's a completely different feeling. And it's something that I don't question anymore, but I did. So I will defer to the next person. Thank you so much.
Thank you. My name is David Weekly, and I'm currently serving a United Methodist Church in Hull, Massachusetts. I was born at a time when there was no internet or social media, and I grew up in an era where there was no language for what I was experiencing. Nothing even close to resemble terms such as gender identity or being transgender. So I was aware at an early age that I was different, and I was having different experiences, experiencing a masculine identity that I acted out and expressed as a child, but I couldn't really articulate it, and neither could my family, because it wasn't heard of at that time. When I was about 12 years old, I began to really feel acutely the differences kind of hitting pre-puberty. And so at that same time, I heard a name, and the name was Christine Jorgensen. And some of you probably have heard of her. I learned that she had gone to Denmark and had successfully transitioned. At that time, the language was transsexual, from male to female. And so when I heard about her story, that gave me some hope and the beginning of some language to use to try to express my feelings to people in my family, in my school, and people that I came to trust. But the idea of gender identity was so rare in the 50s and 60s, it was very, very difficult to try to get support. But I eventually did. I had a few very close friends, and they connected me to some professional adults who eventually got me to what was then called a gender identity clinic. That was in the 1960s and the early 70s. And at that time, there was a very specific process for how one transitioned. The process was according to certain standards of care, the Harry Benjamin standards of care. The person was called a candidate because you had to be kind of selected and make it through a process in order to be allowed to transition. So there was no real agency on the part of the transgender person or the person going through that experience, although I was very grateful for the support. And I did successfully complete that process and transitioned. But one of the things that was taught to the candidates and the people who transitioned at that time was that you did not share your story. I was even encouraged to make up a past and only to share my identity and my history in times of absolute necessity. Medical emergencies or something like that. But after a while, it was really starting to weigh on me. And my faith had been a source of strength and comfort all through this process. God was the person that I turned to for support and courage to get through some very, very difficult years. And so I answered a call to the ministry in 1980. But that was also not a safe time to share that kind of personal story. And so I went through seminary and I graduated, I was ordained, and nobody knew my story as a transgender man. And so I went into the ministry serving congregations. And as I did that, I kept thinking there would be a time when I would share who I was, and I hoped that that would make a positive impact, because if enough people got to know who I was as a good person, as a good pastor, society would simply change. So I did that for 28 years. And at one point, my spouse and I decided there was so much going on in our culture and in the world and in the church, oppressing and causing harm and trauma to LGBTQI folks, that it was time to share that story. And so in 2009, I did share that with my denomination and the congregation I was serving at that time. I was largely supported from former parishioners and folks in the church, but there was pushback, lots of threats and hate mail, colleagues who tried to have my ordination revoked. But one of the results of that also was just hundreds and hundreds of letters, emails, cards, phone calls from other transgender people in the United States and other places. And listening to their stories and them sharing their own rejection stories from faith communities led to a decision. In 2012, we moved to Boston, Massachusetts, where I pursued a degree so I can continue working on issues, spiritual issues and social advocacy with LGBTQI people, especially developing practices of encouragement and spiritual direction for transgender people. Having grown up in a time where I had no rights, I avoided public accommodations or the bathrooms to the point that I have permanent physical damage. And that's the cost that we're talking about for so many people. We've been through it, you know. There was a time where there was health coverage, and I was really fortunate to be one of those people. Then all that was taken away in the 1980s with Janet Ramos and the Reagan administration. Then we've come so far again and made progress, and now again, the attack and the attempts to marginalize and re-vilify transgender people is upon us. And so I just encourage you to vote yes on ballot measure 3 to protect people, people like the people here, young people just growing up, so they don't have to experience what some of older transgender people did go through. So I just thank you for including me in part of this panel and very important work. And I'll move to the next person.
Thank you. As the parent of a transgender child, I feel that the people who have gone before us have paved the way, literally, with their blood, sweat, and tears. And I cannot thank you enough, both of you, all three of you. So my story begins at the other end of the age spectrum. I was a mother of 3 children whom I believed were all female. And back in 2012, when my middle child was roughly 2.5 years old, they put their foot down and told us one day, "You're wrong. What the doctor said was wrong. I am a boy." And at first I thought that was play acting, as I think most people would. Back in 2012, there wasn't a lot out there. In fact, I would go out on a limb and say there was practically nothing about young transgender children. If you Googled the word transgender, if you knew what the word transgender was, because it wasn't commonly used, you would get stories about adults. You would get stories about teenagers at the lowest end, and then adults. And you would get a lot of depressing news. When my child said that they were a boy, I didn't listen at first because I didn't understand there was anything to listen to. But as the 2.5 became 3, became 3.5, my child's happiness was clearly being chipped away. And it wasn't just the terrible 2s or the tremendously terrible 3s, because everyone knows it's worse, right? They were withdrawing. They weren't looking people in the eye. They picked up all manner of tics and anxieties. And it became clear to my husband and me, even though we didn't have a lot of direction when it came to, we did see a therapist, we talked to a therapist, but we hadn't been told that transitioning a child this young made sense. But we decided, we looked at our kid, we saw what was happening to them, and the anger and the hurt that they carried with them every day as they were misidentified, the fact that they were clearly shrinking back into themselves. It seemed to us even that they were living in a world without color. And shortly after Jacob's 4th birthday, we showed him a video that had just come out about a transgender child who was older than him. And we said, this exists. There are transgender people. What do you want us to do? You have to tell us what you want us to do. And that's when he said, I want to be a boy always. And he chose his name. He said, I want to be a boy named Jacob. And that is what he has been every day since. He is a happy child. He is turned on to the world. He sees things in color, and he makes us see things in color. He is a tremendous gift to our family. And he has exemplified the kind of courage that I think should be rewarded by our administration. But sadly, it isn't. And in the same week or same month that the American Academy of Pediatrics has come out with a guidance to all pediatricians to affirm transgender children, to listen to them, and telling people the harm if you don't, and what happens to a child's spirit when they are ignored and invalidated. At the same time, we have from the very top of our country directions to invalidate transgender people's existence, to redefine gender in a narrow way, which is incorrect and unscientific, in order to pave the way for legislative discrimination. It is simply horrific. We went through a period after Jacob's transition when we were simply enjoying the fact that our son had come to life, and it felt like someone had flipped a switch on. But very shortly afterwards, within 9 months, a 17-year-old girl in Ohio stepped in front of a truck, and I realized that not every parent was going to be supportive of their child. And when the conversation began around the death of Leila Alcorn, I realized that not the rest of the country would either. There was a divide. There was so much ignorance. And it swirled in my head, what do I do? What do I do? How can I let Jacob grow up in this world? And after giving it a lot of thought and talking to my family, we decided to begin to advocate. And I think that a lot of parents of transgender kids, whether they're advocating in public or in private, have found that they need to fight for their kids. And the importance of community here is you can lift that burden. You can provide a place to rest. If you hear and see discrimination, if you think the schools aren't caring enough about transgender students, come to meetings and speak up about it. And when you go to the voting booth, vote to protect transgender people's rights, because community can make such a difference to what can be a very lonely journey. And I want to give you one very funny example. Well, funny, amazing, miraculous. I'm in a church. I feel like talking about miracles. A miraculous example of how community can come to bolster you in unexpected times. After Jacob's transition, the following year, my older daughter, who is his greatest advocate, was going to be entering kindergarten at the Roosevelt School here. And I felt very strongly that I wanted to pave the way for Jacob so that when he got to school, there would be books and literature and things about transgender experience in age-appropriate ways so that he wouldn't have to explain himself if he just wanted to be himself and talk about, hey, I'm transgender. And the kids would be like, okay, we read a book about that. And so when I went to my first PTO meeting and I discovered that they had a couple of, I think, $500 left in the budget over from last year, and they said, what do you guys want to spend it on? And they turned the question to the parents. And I went home, and I didn't raise my hand then, but I went home, and I had the email of the PTO presidents. There were 2 of them, and I said, I'm doing it. I'm going to write, and I'm going to ask them to have books about gender identity, and I'm going to tell them that my kid's transgender. This was before I had written my piece about, it started my public advocacy. And I got a phone call like 5 minutes later. I said, oh my God, ask and you shall receive. Oh God, I hope they're not going to say something awful. And so I went into the other room because my husband was watching TV, and it was Liz, who was one of the PTO presidents. And she strung me along for a good 5 minutes, telling me that everything would be okay. She had our back, and she felt that the community would have our back because she knew this community better than we did because we had only been there for a few years. And then a few minutes in, and as I'm thinking, boy, is she amazing. I love this woman already. She said, well, we have to stick together. We're a small community, but we have to stick together, people like us. And she was referring to my son. And I said, what do you mean? And when I came out of the room and went back to my husband, I said, put everything down because you're not going to believe this. The PTO co-president, soccer mom, is transgender. And at that moment, I knew we were going to be okay. But not everyone has a Liz. But we do have voters who can go to the voting booth and make sure that Massachusetts is heard loud and clear saying discrimination has no place here. And so I'm really hoping that not only will you, I know everyone in this room is on board, you're all gonna go November 3rd, 6th and vote, or earlier. But we need you to share the word with other people. We need you to tell people that this is how you're voting. And when you see discrimination or you see people who aren't sure what to do, because there's been a lot of confusion out there by the opposition, a lot of false statements coming out, please stand up and say something about it. There's a wonderful, very short link on freedommassachusetts.org, and it links to something called Mythbusters. And there you will read that there has been no increase in any kind of crime that has been promised by the opposition if we give transgender people their rights. There have been no increase in harassment of women and children in public spaces since the law has been passed 2 years ago. And the Massachusetts Chiefs of Police have supported this law because it makes people safer, and they know it, as have women's rights groups and rape crisis centers across Massachusetts. There are no fines for people who are confused about whether their clients are transgender or say something if they think someone's behaving inappropriately in a bathroom. That's untrue. There's no $50,000 fine, as you will see on the ads of the opposition. That is if a public place that serves the public repeatedly, 3 times or more, violates the law and discriminates openly and provably over a 7-year period. But they will make you think that any father who sees somebody peeping over a stall at his child will go to jail for saying something. These are all things that are blatantly false. So please speak up and speak the truth because we need it now more than ever. Thank you.
She is such a tough act to follow. I'm Eli, and I'm here from Speak Out, and Stacey already gave such a wonderful introduction to Speak Out that I don't need to do that. But I do want to share two of the Speak Out kind of ground rules because I think they're really important here. And one is that I'm not speaking for all transgender people. So even though the title of this event is Understanding the Transgender Experience, it's really more like you're understanding some transgender experiences. And so we can tell you our stories, but not all stories. And the other one that I really love is Ask Me Anything. And so I can speak for myself here. Ask me anything. I truly mean this. So at the end, when you have questions, really anything goes. So I wanted to kind of put those out there first. And I'd like to tell, I guess, a story of growing up Catholic and going to Catholic school. So also kind of a story of youth and being seen as different. And my first experience of this was first grade. So picture it, suburban New York, 1983. First grade classroom, and I'm just sitting there, probably doing my penmanship lesson. And full disclosure, I have been told this story by my mom. She remembers me coming home and telling it. I don't remember it actually happening anymore, which is probably good. And that first grade teacher, man, she took one look at me and she could tell something was different about me. I wasn't like most of the other children she had seen come through that classroom. And she marched over to me. She took my pencil right out of my hand, grabbed my other hand, put it in it, and said, "That's the hand we write with." You guys didn't think I was going there, did you? You thought I was going somewhere else. But that was my first experience of, you're different and we're going to fix it, even though there's really no good reason for this to be a problem. And well, my mom got word of that from me, and she went and tore that school down brick by brick and stood atop the rubble and loudly proclaimed, "She is left-handed and you will leave her alone." And so they did. And then several years passed, and there were no problems, and I was total tomboy. I had no idea what gender identity was. If you'd asked me what mine was and I knew what the term meant, I would have said tomboy. I thought tomboys just grew up to be big tomboys or men, or I don't know what I thought, but everything was fine, and everyone thinks tomboy's just fine when you're 6 and 7 and 9. And then there's this kind of magical age around 11 when suddenly it's not cute, it's not funny, it's not even okay. They start trying to fix you. And that's when I went from the happy-go-lucky kid to pulling into that shell that Mimi described. And I remember I still got to play with the boys. The boys didn't care. The adults cared. The boys didn't care. We played tackle sports at recess. And I came in from recess one day, sweaty, happy, and the principal was standing there at the entrance to the school. Now, the principal standing there looking at you like this is intimidating, but this woman was 6'2", built like an NFL linebacker. I mean, just broad, big. And she grabbed my arm, and I do remember this incident. I will never forget this incident. It is the first time an adult, not my parent, grabbed me in a way that made me think they were going to hurt me. And she grabbed my arm so hard, I think it left bruises, and she said, "Why do you play with the boys? You should be playing with the girls." And I was just kind of, blinking at her. I'm like, because they play hopscotch? I didn't comprehend why this was such a momentous occasion that this woman had to grab me and prevent me from moving until I answered her question. And she said, "Tomorrow you'll be playing with the girls." I didn't. And that was, I think, 7th grade. And then the sex ed unit came. That's awkward anyway. It's even more awkward when you have to read out of this religious book that just kind of dryly goes through the reproductive system and how you're not going to use it for many, 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 many years until you're married. And we would read a paragraph at a time, and they would march down the rows, and you knew exactly when you were reading, so you could sneak your book under your desk and just be like, oh, my turn's next. Except she stopped when she got to a certain paragraph, and she being the principal, because the principal has to come in and teach the sex ed unit. The teacher can't possibly do it. And she said, "Elizabeth, why don't you read this paragraph?" And it was the paragraph about how wonderful it was that God had given us our womanly bodies that were like flowers and blah, blah, blah. It was the most embarrassing moment of my school life until that point. So this just got worse and worse. It was like this campaign to change me until the coup de grace in 8th grade, when the teacher announced that day the boys would go outside for recess like normal and the girls would stay inside and decorate bulletin boards. Because that's a totally appropriate thing to say to children. And And so recess came, and I picked up the football and went to go outside to play. And I wish I could say that I was a warrior for feminism, but I was just basically like, oh, the boys go outside. That's what I am. The boys go outside. And the girls threw a fit, said, you can't do that. And I was like, watch me. And sure enough, at the end of recess, I got sent down to the principal's office and read the riot act and how tomorrow I would be inside with the bulletin boards. And something possessed me to actually tell my mom this story, even though we'd already started to have conflict about my gender nonconformity. But I told her this one. And she went in and tore that school down brick by brick. I didn't find out till years later that she'd threatened a Title IX lawsuit. And sure enough, the next day, everybody went out for recess. And that was the last time my mom defended my gender. And that's a totally different story. But unfortunately, what I got out of all those experiences was I went from being a really enthusiastic Catholic who loved the Mass and loved the pageantry. I was a lector. And I went from that to a deep distrust of Catholicism and organized religion by extension. And that has taken years to repair. And so what I hope you take home from my story is that religion has incredible power. And it can be power to harm, and it can be power to heal. And I think you said to spread the word, and I know that you meant that as a little small W, but you're called to spread the big W word. And I think part of the way you can do that is by advocating for treating difference like something to celebrate, and for the dignity of all people. And that's what I hope you might take home from this. So thank you for having us. Thank you for coming.
So thank you all. And so we're coming to the question and answer time. And Eli has already set some parameters from your prior experience. Ask anything, I think, is the guideline that you have offered. But I wanted to I want to check in with Mimi, David, and Liz and say, are there any, you've done this a lot, are any guidelines or suggestions for our participants in terms of how to engage in this time of question and answer?
It's just your time to ask questions, and as Eli said, I think we all agree you can ask anything. If there's something that's offensive, we'll just respectfully decline to answer.
The worst I will say is I'm not comfortable answering that. We find ourselves mindful that my experience may mirror many of our experiences. My experience is mine alone. That said, there are very few things that we won't share, that I won't share. Most of us that are up here, I think I can say with some degree of confidence, we have taken on the role of educator about this issue, and we wouldn't be here if we weren't.
Great.
And I think that's accurate.
That don't ask transgender people on the street anything.
Right. Yes.
You can ask us anything.
Full license here.
Yeah.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for being educators with us. So, time to ask some questions, and we're going to be using the microphone, and so if you would wait for me to come and share it with you.
Thank you all very much for sharing your different stories. I think a lot of us are here because there is a sense of urgency with this vote coming up in just a few weeks, and some of you spoke to that, but I'm just curious on fleshing this out. When these protections were brought into play for you, what did that mean for you at that moment? Take us beyond the bathroom. What does it mean if they get taken away in other contexts in your life?
I could talk for hours. Does anyone else want to jump in?
I hesitate to talk because my son is very young, and I feel like the experiences of the transgender adults in the room will bring a more immediacy to what might happen if this law gets taken away. But when I think about my son's future, I don't want him to live in a place where he can be kicked out or denied service or given inferior service because of his gender identity. And while a bathroom is a requisite part of a public accommodation, by law they have to have bathrooms, and we have bodies that function the way that they do, so we need to use them. It means everything that I do during my day that I take for granted, like going to Dunkin' Donuts for coffee or Starbucks or stopping into a doctor's to pick up or to get a prescription for something, and then to go to the pharmacy and fill it, and then to go to the dry cleaners and pick something up, and then to meet someone for coffee, and then maybe to go out with friends for dinner or see a movie or go to the theater. All of that becomes dangerous. And as a mother, that is a horrifying thought. Not only for my son, who may never be confronted, maybe with the proper medical intervention or whatever. He may always, to strangers, look like just another boy. But what about the transgender women who are harassed constantly wherever they go? It matters, it really matters. And I'll let the adults speak to their experiences.
I'm actually going to put my researcher hat on for this one because, do I think that if it gets voted no the next day, I'll get kicked off the tee? Probably not. But the effect that just knowing that people get to vote on your civil rights, like it's whether a building should go up on the corner, that's demoralizing. That's something you live with every day. And it didn't really hit me until I was just standing in Bruegger's, just ordering a bagel. And suddenly I just looked around at all these diverse people from all walks of life. And I remember thinking, oh my gosh, some of the people in this room are going to vote to say that I don't deserve civil rights. And I don't know who they are. They're everywhere, but I don't know who they are. And so it's like living under a constant threat at some level, that people think that this should even be something that should go on a ballot. I'm deeply concerned about the message this sends to kids. We're doing a study right now with transgender teens and their family members, and hearing person after person, this doesn't just hurt trans people, this hurts their families, this hurts their loved ones. We have siblings of trans teens who are like, I'm so scared, like I see what's happening in North Carolina, and I'm like, what if they're going to do that to my brother? The kids are watching, they're always watching, and they're learning. And they're either learning that it's okay to treat other people this way, or they're learning that people think it's okay to treat them and their loved ones this way. And so, if anything, this is more at a macro level, like the message we send as a state. And do not be deceived. The people who are funding this and driving this from outside the state picked this state on purpose because we have this reputation of being this progressive bastion. If they can win here, they are taking this to North Carolina, to Texas, to Wyoming, because they're going to be galvanized. They're going to go after everybody in this country. And so we kind of have to be this bulwark against that. And so, at a micro level, for me, do I think this will change much for my life? No, but I'm incredibly privileged. I am white. I am educated. I am from a stable socioeconomic position. I live in Newton. Those are very protective for me, and there are people who don't have those protections, those intersectional protections that I have, and so we have to be looking out for them too.
Do you want to go?
Yeah, I would just add that when I started out as a young adult, newly having completed my medical transition, I had no protections then, and I was able to legally change my name, but no other documents. That added a lot of stress and trauma to my life, like the night I was pulled over by the police, and they looked at my driver's license and started to laugh, and they made a joke of it because they just thought it was a typo on the license, right, the gender marker. But I realized what a huge problem that was. And so I couldn't get my license changed at that time. There was no legal way to do that. So I creatively mutilated the license right where the gender marker was, and went back and got a fresh one, and they never questioned it, so I got the correct. But I had to be very creative. I had no rights. As a college student in an undergraduate college, every time I pushed open the door and went into the men's room, my heart was in my throat because I didn't know what to expect. But I already had damage from staying out of public accommodations for so long, I wasn't going to continue to do that. These are the kind of things to think about, what you're asking to impose back on people or on young people just growing up. You know, we don't want to go back to that, and Massachusetts is a test case. Most of the funding has come from outside this state, so it's critical to vote and to understand that there's a lot more at stake than just this one ballot measure. It's only the tip of the iceberg.
I'll give a couple more tangible experiences that I have had. It was being laughed at the polling place when I went to vote, and my name didn't hadn't changed on the voter roll, but it had on my driver's license. Laughed out of the room by the officer on site. It's having to exit the building to use the restroom. It's having worked at a company and performed at the same level as everybody else, if not better, and not been promoted for more than 10 years. How about being constantly misgendered in the emergency room when you're passing kidney stones? Or maybe when you have to go in for that small surgical procedure and they're laughing at you because of your anatomy versus your clothing. Look, I'm not naive. I understand that you cannot legislate societal opinion, right? The passage of this law in 2016, I want to acknowledge Rep. Brodeur is here, and he spoke on the floor. I was a guest of his and able to witness him speaking on the floor. And he made the comment on the floor of the State House that in 2015, when Melrose elected a transgender person, the sky did not fall. Business on Main Street carried on as usual. And ultimately, if you had met us on the street, would you know? And does it matter? I would argue that it doesn't matter, except that with human rights on the ballot, it absolutely does. It absolutely does. The point that was made earlier that the message this sends to our children is so crucial, it's so key. The language, words matter. The language that we're hearing from the White House, from the Congress, from the various legislative branches, words matter. You have people like the gentleman in New Mexico who is being charged for sexual assault because the president said he could grope a woman and therefore I can grope a woman. Words matter. The narrow ruling of defining gender as what is strictly your chromosomal matter. What about those and bear with me, I'm a science geek, but what about those 46 different conditions that are intersex that aren't clearly defined as XX or XY? Where do you put them? We are in a place, a fantastic place of God, a worship. And I will tell you that my own interaction with my church is also very tortured. But when I did come back, because I left because I didn't want to be a part of an organization that condemned me. When I did come back, I spoke to my pastor, and I remember this very clearly over lunch, and said, does God have a sense of humor? Why did he make me? That's a pretty heavy question. And I am happy to talk religious quotes. I happen to know my scripture fairly well, and I can give you some if you like. But the point is, I think that he is open to all of us. He knew us all, and he should accept us as well. It says so in Romans when he says he knew us in the womb. It says so in Acts when the eunuch was allowed to be baptized. We're all welcome. I just wish society understood that we were welcome too.
question. Yeah.
Thank you all so much for being here and for sharing your stories. And so aside from voting yes on 3, how can we best support our young people who might be transgender or might be wondering if they are or questioning their gender identity?
It's critically important that we hold our schools to a high standard where it comes that we all, people, especially parents who don't have transgender children, should inquire of their schools. What do you do to teach gender identity on a spectrum? What do you do to support people of non-conforming gender identities? I think also it's an important message when you invite speakers to a place in town, when you make sure to include programming when you're doing something as a town leader. I think that's really important. But for me, when I think about the youth, I think about the schools primarily. And I think that it's, I mean, as a parent of a transgender kid, I've been lucky, but I don't think the schools are always quick to pick up everywhere the need for advanced preparation of the student body so that a transgender child doesn't step into a gauntlet. And I think many schools make that mistake. And they say, oh, I only have 1 or 2 students. How many will I ever get as my tenure as a principal? That's not the way we need to be looking about it. It's the bigger picture. It's the meta. And it's also a fact, and I know this because I have 2 cisgender that's not transgender daughters. When we create an environment where gender is respected on a spectrum, we begin to be a little less sexist towards our cisgender daughters too. When we stop forcing people into boxes, I think we all benefit. So for the children, I think making sure that there's support for the parents, there's things in the town that are helpful, and in the schools that there is education, appropriate, respectful education, and no tolerance, genuinely no tolerance, not lip service to no tolerance for bullying on any form. So that's what I would say. School committee member.
Just a follow-up question. You use the term cisgendered, and I'm not sure if everybody would be familiar with that term. So if you could just...
Not transgender. So cis means the same in Latin, I believe. I don't know if who's here has the same side. Yes.
That's accurate.
So when you're cisgender like myself, my gender identity accords with my sex assigned at birth. But if you're transgender, it's a crossing where it's not identical.
Thank you.
Can I piggyback off of that?
Yep, please.
I think one of the things that's really simplest for people to do, especially if you have kids, is to just be mindful of and push back as much as you can on unnecessary gendering of life. Because we're talking about transgender experiences, and this is very timely right now with question 3, but gender role, the boxes, as you put it, gender roles hurt everybody. They hurt cisgender people. We have girls striving to meet this unrealistic beauty ideal and starving themselves. We have boys who are afraid to cry and express emotions because that's the message they got that they can't do that. Those lead to health problems down the road. So everyone's suffering from this. So I laugh when I think about this. I have a niece. She's amazing. I'll force pictures on all of you if you come up to me afterwards. I called her my nephew when she was in utero and we didn't know what her assigned gender was going to be. So far, she seems like she's a girl, but she'll tell me later. But I remember, saying to my sister something like, oh, you shouldn't gender her. And she's like, I don't gender her. The kid has a pink bow in her hair, a pink dress on with lace all around here, and like little white socks and like the little patent leather shoes. And I'm like, no, you're doing a great job, honey. You're doing great with that not gendering your kid thing. So like even just something that subtle of this whole pink and blue, well, 100 years ago it was reversed. The boys were wearing the pink because it was the color of royalty. So like these very arbitrary, silly things that we've decided this is for boys and this is for girls, just like, okay, oh, it's a boy in a dress, no big deal. It's a piece of fabric. So trying to just kind of let your kids do what they do and not worrying about whether it's for boys or for girls, and that can just help make the world safer for everybody.
And I think what a lot of schools today that are being mindful of this are not doing practices like all the girls, line up on this side of the room, all the boys on this. I remember when in preschool they said like, okay, all the boys stand up to show, it was something that they were showing, and I remember that moment where I just didn't know what my kid would do. And it was like a parent thing. And I saw the look on his face, and I just thought to myself, this is so unnecessary. And it really is. There's other ways to do it. So everyone whose name begins with A to M, or, N to Z. So that might help.
Other thoughts on?
I alluded to, I think I actually stated, I grew up in a Navy household, right? And so I lived all across the western United States and even down on the bayou for a couple years. And so I've seen a fair amount of diversity. And I have to tell you that diversity, be it in gender, be it in race, be it in hair color, it doesn't matter. Diversity makes me smile. And ultimately, diversity is the spice of life. It's what makes the world go around, right? And I don't want to litigate what Melrose Public Schools is doing. I will say that we do strive very hard to provide a safe space for students to explore their gender. I will also say that we're part of an athletic conference that has boys soccer and girls soccer. Boys sports this and girls sports that. And it's I wonder a lot about those students that are somewhere in between on this spectrum. And where do they play? And what kinds of messages are we sending when we are gendering those roles? I'm very heartened to know that prom is no longer an absolute must to have a boy-girl date. Boys can go with boys, girls can go with girls, they can go as a big group. But we do have work. We do have work to do. Despite the tremendous amount of work that has gone on in our schools by our teachers and our administrators it's not merely accommodate, it's accept and provide access to thrive for our students. We've got some educators in the room, and they have done some fantastic work. Our GSA does do outreach to our parents so that they can be aware. We have a thriving gay-straight alliance GSA at the middle school, and they don't call it that, but an equivalent at the high school. And it's all because we have such a warm environment. That said, every school district in Massachusetts only has students for 6 hours and 22 minutes every day. And we can't control what they're listening to at home, what they're watching on TV. And so what they bring to us in the school, this is why we have things like Restorative Circle or Restorative Justice, where we try to include students and broaden their horizons in ways that is less outright punitive, more broadening of horizons and raising awareness. But it doesn't work everywhere. And again, 6 hours and 22 minutes, we can only provide so much support.
David, did you want to comment on this question?
Yeah, just briefly. I'm not from Melrose. I'm from Portland, Oregon originally, but one of the things that I think was very effective or is effective out there is, well, as Liz said, the GSA clubs make such a huge difference. I think I read recently that GSA clubs cause a huge decline in the rate of suicide attempts for all students, not just LGBTQI. But also in Portland, in addition to the school systems, there's been a lot of advocacy and inclusivity of transgender and other diverse kinds of people on library commissions, educating the police department, which can become especially important as minority youth hit puberty and are out there more independent. It's made a big difference to have a couple of transgender educators on the police roundtable. So other places in the community that you can think of where you could advocate, getting books into the public libraries that express about gender diversity, looking at all the organizations in your community and ways that you might help educate them.
And if I could just build off that for just briefly, David mentioned suicide rates. The suicide rate for transgender people is 9 times the national average. It's 40%. 40% of that 27,000 have attempted suicide in their life. Compare that to 4.5% in the national average. So any support and any safe space, any just acceptance of who you are as a person you can give, it goes a very long way.
The nonprofit sector, and sometimes a practice that some of my immediate associates and I are beginning to do is identify what our pronouns, our preferred pronouns are. And so it's in our signature on our email, he, him, his are my pronouns, and often when doing introductions. But we find resistance in different spaces, but do you find that kind of practice to be helpful as a way of just kind of like making it more overt, or do you have any thought on?
I open every church meeting with that practice, and it's really a helpful thing to do. Yeah.
So go around the table, say your name, get acquainted, and identify the pronouns that you like to use. Yeah.
I like the idea of volunteering that information. I have heard from other transgender people that for some people that can, if it's kind of a mandatory thing, like do this, people who aren't out yet, or who might not be comfortable sharing their pronouns, it could make them a little uncomfortable. So I think doing things like setting the example, and then if people want to follow the lead, great, might be more effective than saying like, this is what we will do.
Mandatory. Yeah, good. Thank you. Another question.
Hi. Just hearing about the terminology, what I think about like the multiple oppressions and groups that have faced oppression, a lot of the times it's around language and the right terms to use. And when I hear your stories and Jacob's, it sounds like a common thread is like you guys knew before the world did. You had to tell them, right? You knew who you were, and the struggle was to overcome what you needed to overcome, to express that, and find the courage to be who you are, essentially. And I just want to get your thoughts on like terms, like notably like transgender. When I was talking to my son, because we were talking about this, and I was trying to help him understand the best way that I could. I think some of the questions that came to me was like, they hear the word trans and they think of like going from one thing to another, and I'm wondering if could that be misleading or reductionistic, because they're thinking, okay, there's got to be some sort of transition there biologically maybe, and it sounds like that may happen in some individuals, but really it's more about becoming who you are. Maybe not, as opposed to transitioning. So I just didn't know if there was any talk around that in terms of, or do you see maybe further evolution in some of these terms?
So my understanding was that the word trans came from kind of opposite, or as opposed to cis, which is on the same side. So gender and sex assigned at birth on the same side and not on the same. But
Yeah, kind of. I think the original meaning, I think it probably stemmed originally from the word transsexual, which is now not really considered a good term to be using. It's very medicalized and kind of an old-fashioned term. But that idea of moving across, like you started here, you are going to here. And so transgender the terminology is really rapidly evolving at some level, so you're getting kind of like the academic answer here. But right now, generally in common usage, transgender is a very umbrella term that's used to describe anyone whose gender identity, their sense of themselves as a gendered being in the world, is different from that, what the term that's often used is the sex assigned at birth, or the designated sex at birth, because really that is an assignment. A doctor looks, is there a penis? Yes, no. Put something on the birth certificate accordingly. They don't usually do chromosomal testing. They don't do any of that. And so you just kind of get slapped with this label that follows you and affects what color clothes people put you in and things like that. So it's basically just if your sense of who you are is different from whatever's on that piece of paper, transgender is a word that can describe that. There is a little bit of debate internally about, what types of people that could describe. There are people who identify as non-binary, so basically not one or the other, not male, not female, not man, not woman, so somewhere maybe in between or outside the system entirely. And so some of those people agree with being called transgender because it doesn't match what they were assigned, and some people are like, no, I don't really like the word transgender, I'd rather be called non-binary. Basically the gist of it is, generally speaking, transgender is describing people who fit that category of not the same as what they were told they were at birth. And when in doubt, ask a person what word they like to use to describe themselves. Ask a person, what pronouns would you like me to use for you? And trans people will get what you're getting at and will answer that question. I got asked that on a plane the other day. The flight attendant came up and was like, what are your pronouns? And I just smiled. I was like, oh, he, him, his. And she's like, oh, thank you. So yeah, just is that generally pretty? Yeah.
Yeah, I led a retreat a couple of years ago for what started out for transgender people, but some of the folks that wanted to come to the retreat didn't like that terminology. And so asking people what they prefer is important. And I've some people like gender nonconforming. Some people, the most recent one has been gender expansive. And so there's a lot of different terminology and language, and I think language is really important for individuals. And so asking what terms they prefer is the best way to start out.
I'll give one easy hint though. Transgender is an adjective, not a noun. So you would never call someone a transgender. And transgendered, like it's been done to us, is also not a good term to use. So, yeah, like a transgender person.
But I think I kind of hear a wistfulness in what you were asking that I think that my son shares because he doesn't want to be a transgender boy. He wants to be, and he is a boy. I think that I understand, I have that sense of discomfort, like when I'm talking and I'm always saying, my transgender son, my transgender friend, because this is part of the world I'm advocating, I discuss it all the time, but to me, and what it ought to be to everyone else is just son or friend. And I think we're in this, this big crock pot of changing the world and making it different, and this is the exigency, and you're hearing this term so much and you're like, it doesn't fit right because I don't want to see anybody as different. And I don't know if that's what I'm reading in what you were saying, and let's just say hopefully one day it's just my friend, my son, my father, my sister.
Like being lefty.
Yeah. I'm a lefty.
Or Ambi. Yeah. Another question. Yep.
So a couple of weeks ago, I was dealing with some teachers and helping them kind of get familiar with some concepts around this issue. And at one point, it became clear that, when I was a kid, gender and sex were synonyms. And can you help us understand what the difference is between, it's a pretty elementary question, but the difference between gender and sex?
Can I jump in? Is that okay real quick? Gender is between the ears. Sex is your plumbing, as it were. Yeah, we'll stick with that. But that begs the question of orientation, and I want to differentiate orientation from identity. And maybe I want to throw this back at you for you to think about orientation a little differently. Orientation is not who I'm attracted to. It describes who my partner is and what your perception of my gender is. So if we think about that a little bit more, that doesn't necessarily mean that because I'm married to a woman, I'm a lesbian. It means that you view me as a woman, and I'm married to a woman, therefore, you describe me as. It's your description of me. It's orientation as you define it, not how I've defined myself. Who I'm attracted to is who I'm attracted to. Which leads on to, Mr. Whittier, a different discussion in terms of sexuality and bisexuality. And I really want to get the idea that orientation and sexuality is wholly separate in terms of discussion versus gender identity. An apple's an apple, whether you were born an orange or not.
Yeah, it's a really important point.
It's not really a question, but you're probably not surprised by that. Some of you have talked to me before. Liz, we've been at a couple of these together. It always comes back to the follically challenged. At some point, someone makes a reference to that. It's, it's a little bit disappointing, but we'll soldier through. I think it's important to remember kind of how we got here, because in some respects, it's kind of a hopeful story, and it is hopefully how this campaign will work and be really successful. So we started out in the legislature in my first term where we did kind of a halfway transgender rights bill, where we did essentially everything except public accommodations, because that was the most challenging thing quite frankly, for the body, for the folks who were voting, and for their constituents, or so they thought. Some time passed, and we got to the last session, and there was a lot of, I think, concern, caution, trepidation amongst certainly the members of the House, maybe the members of the Senate as well. But when we finally made the commitment to go forward and do public accommodations, it's important for folks to understand that the vote was overwhelming. The vote was a veto-proof, bipartisan majority in both chambers. Veto-proof meaning you have to have at least 2/3 in each body supporting the measure. So that means Republicans from challenging districts, Democrats from very challenging districts. There was not unanimity within the Democratic caucus. I think there might have been on the Senate side. There was definitely not on the House side. But I think one of the reasons why the vote was so overwhelming was because of the nature of the debate. Both the run-up to the actual floor debate, where folks like these folks up here came in and told their stories, kind of humanized the issue, and then a vote on the floor where folks got it through those conversations, through that debate. That's really, I think, what this campaign is. It's telling your story. I'd like to think that it's going to be an overwhelming majority. The polls say it is. But we have seen for the last couple of years that polls don't always tell us exactly the way it's going to go. And I think this is a case where I'm not sure folks are candidly going to say to a pollster, no, I'm for discrimination. I think we should roll back the law. That having been said, I do think we can win, and we can win overwhelmingly because of how I saw the debate evolve in the House. But now it's not on 160 people in the House and 40 in the Senate. It's on 7 million people, across Massachusetts. So there is a lot of work to do, but I think there is hope in that. And how it got on the ballot is an important thing to consider too, because you probably, as things go on the ballot, you think you need this overwhelming number of signatures to get something on the ballot. So there must be a huge amount of traction behind this. Not in this case. In this case, there's different requirements for different ways you get things on the ballot. For the repeal of a law, which what this is under our kind of statutory scheme, you need about 35,000 signatures, which is 1.5%, I think, of the folks who actually voted in the last election. That means a very small, activated minority can go forward on the ballot. This is not to change the law. This is not to tweak the law, which are options these folks had if they really were upset about a particular part of the law. And that's not what they chose to do. They chose to do this because I think their goal is to undermine the very idea of equal justice under the law and equal rights for all. But it's also because it was the easiest way for them to move their question forward. So I think as hard as the debate is going to be and as challenging as the campaign is going to be, particularly for the next few weeks when you're going to see some, I think, some quite frankly shocking ads from the opponents of this law, there's a lot of reason to hope, because there's a lot of diversity of political thought within the legislature, and unlike in the national government, we did have an overwhelming bipartisan consensus that this is the way Massachusetts should be.
Thank you. Thank you.
And I just wanted to say that when our family began to advocate, it was Rep. Roeder who opened up every door for us in the State House and personally brought us around to meet with representatives and made sure that we were heard and continued to fight. So we have a hometown treasure here. Thank you.
It does seem to be sort of a volatile social milieu right now for trigger topics. So thanks for the heads up there. Yeah. Yes.
So I'm a transgender man, and I just wanted to share a little different perspective, I guess. I just started transitioning a couple years ago, and you know, looking at Jacob, knowing at 2.5 years old, 4 years old, I too knew very young age, but again, like everybody else, didn't have the words for it, didn't know how to describe it to my parents or anything. But what happened with me, and I think this is something that people should be aware of, is it's not always along the same continuum. So I knew something was different until I was about 13. And that's when I was exposed to a lot of men, boys, that I did not like. I was not gonna be like them, you know? And anybody in the Me Too movement, anybody with friends and female relatives and things kind of knows, you know, that men are not always on their best behavior. So I actually fought it for many, many years because I enjoyed the sisterhood, my neighbor over there, and I still do. You know, I didn't want to lose the sisterhood, first of all, but I also, I was like, I am not that, you know, the stereotypical what, you know, boys and men are sometimes raised to be. So I fought it for many years. So I just mainly want people to know that if you do have children or relatives that go through the continuum, it may be because it took me, other than my dad, who was amazing, but you know, as you get older, you spend less and less time with your dad. You know, because you're in school, not because of any other reason. It took to getting back into my career again and getting stable and knowing that, you know, there's not as much of a risk now, you know, that I can finally pull the trigger and do this. But I also came across some men that I work with now that are just showing the side of men that I needed to see, that I hadn't seen in so many years. You know, the good guys, and that finally gave me the ability to pull the trigger. But so just if you do have people that waver and you think, you know, my kid knew when they were 4, how come this kid doesn't know, or how come it took this person a while? They probably did know, but there were probably reasons why they just kind of questioned a little bit of their identity along the way, based on that.
Thank you. Yes, thanks very much. We have time for another question, and then there's going to be a time to have refreshments across the hall and visit informally. So is there somebody holding a thought or a question? Yes.
While all this issue of the particular vote is obviously extraordinarily important, what I'm concerned about is what I see coming from Washington, the talk of the Health and Human Services wanting to change guidelines to totally ignore the existence of the transgender people in the United States. And this type of attitude, both of ignoring the transgender, gay, and other populations that are so terribly important and a part of the whole fabric of the community of this nation, and kind of ask how can we as citizens respond to this, or at least make known our disappointment in these things which makes America small again.
Well, my passport states that I'm male, because the State Department has yet to see fit to change that. So I'm pretty restricted in where I could travel internationally. My family, we have had conversations about filing our taxes this year and how that may be a little bit more challenging than it has been in previous years. Ultimately, this is another attempt from the top down to marginalize or just outright ignore us. And the way you fight that, the saying is all politics is local. And the way you fight that is make sure that your community is on board, and I can tell you Melrose is. Make sure your state is on board, and that's what's on the ballot here. And make sure that those that represent you are on board. And I can attest that they are.
And I think it is very important to continue to hold officials accountable to write to local newspapers about issues. We need to hear voices that aren't just transgender people or parents. We need other people to start picking that up as well. And I want to give an example. When the law was set to be passed in 2016, it passed the House first, I believe, Rep. Brody, you'll have to, and up to almost the very last minute, the governor of Massachusetts did not indicate if he would veto it or not. And there was a networking event, an LGBTQ networking event in downtown Boston that's held every year, and people came to silently protest that event because the governor was speaking, and he had not indicated, and there was word that he was going to say how he felt about the bill passing, if it would, would he sign it? And that would really help direct a lot of the way the legislators thought about it. And he talked about railroad tracks. I was there. He talked about football and baseball and the MBTA and opioid crisis and all these things. And there was this whole group of transgender people waiting to hear what would happen to their lives. And the hall erupted. And I'm not going to make any sort of judgment about that fact, that the hall erupted and people started yelling and he had to leave the stage. But I know that right after that, he had been invited to an event and his invitation was rescinded. And right after that, other groups stood up and started saying things, and businesses were like, this is not okay. If we're silent because we're so exhausted, we don't hold our leaders accountable. And maybe he had intended to vote yes anyway, but for exigent reasons he was holding off, but very soon after he had to say, I am going to be supporting this. And that made a huge difference at the very end, at the finish line. Even if it's not the guy you voted for, you can still hold them accountable. Businesses can hold them accountable. Organizations can, individuals can. We're all exhausted, but we need to keep going.
A couple of things on similar lines. You have a community here, and I think part of the goal is to exhaust us. I really think that's part of the plan, is that if you just keep hammering, eventually people stop fighting back. It's exhausting. And so when I asked once, how do we keep doing this? Someone said, you just trust that you take a moment to rest and catch your breath, and you trust that someone else is moving forward while you're resting, and then you move forward and let someone else rest. And so being able to tap into the power of your communities and support each other in your activism work. And also, even though we're exhausted and even though I'm under threat, trying to remember that other people are too, and sometimes it's a little less exhausting to fight for someone else. So remembering that we're going on almost 200 days of keeping children in cages. A school teacher was shot in his car after following every single instruction the police officer gave him. We have other marginalized populations that are undergoing the same threat. And so trying to remember to fight for them too, I think is helpful for me. It reminds me that it's not just all about me, and that's the last thing they want, is us all banding together.
I think I'd like to add that lobbying, calling representatives, calling your political leaders is important, but I've also come to realize how important it is to talk to my neighbors. I hear comments, I live in a very small town, everybody knows I'm transgender, and I think it's important to be available for conversations, just in informal conversations, but talk to your neighbors, because I'll go into places and hear incredible comments made. My spouse was in a building the other day and overheard two people talking, and one of them saying, well, I wasn't planning to vote, but I'm going to go vote just so I can vote on that transgender bathroom issue. And so when you hear things like that, or you have a neighbor who, or a friend who makes comments, take the time to sit down and have a genuine conversation. Sometimes we're afraid to do that, but it can make all the difference in the world, I think.
If I could just tack on one quick, we're all exhausted. Who I fight for, aside from Jacob and Eli and David and myself, I fight for that young girl who was sat outside on the bleachers during an active intruder activity, and the boys were sent to the boys' room, and the girls were sent to the girls' room, and the teachers debated where they should send this young girl rather than keep her safe. I fight for the kids.
You all, and I'm wondering if you have any other final comments that you would like to share, any thoughts, or any question that we have not asked that you would like to respond to at this point. A final word?
Ultimately, trans rights are human rights, and it's shameful that this is on the ballot, but it is. And so, while we should never be in a situation where we have to vote on human rights, we do. So the collective ask, and everyone can make their own, but mine is that I'm asking that you affirm my humanity, affirm our collective humanity, and you affirm by voting yes on 3. Thank you all for coming.
We really appreciate you coming. I know some of you came a long way in bad weather to be here tonight, but it's a really important topic, and we appreciate your candid sharing with us. And I thank you all for coming as well. We invite you to join us for refreshments across the hall and continuing conversation. But I just it's my prayer that we will reaffirm our commitment to making sure that all God's people are accepted and safe and included. Amen. Thank you.